товарищ Сталин, вы ушли от нас. Нет слов сказать, как тяжко мы страдаем. Вы были с нами в войнах и походах.
Наш самоотверженный труд будет лучшим памятником нашему любимому вождю и учителю Иосифу Виссарионовичу Сталину.
On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died. After 30 years in power in the Soviet Union, his regime came to an end. The official report announced that the cause of death was natural, but was it really so? Immediately after his death, a bloody struggle for the throne began, claiming even more lives. For some, this was a way to silence witnesses of a conspiracy that had achieved its goal, to assassinate the infamous Russian dictator. Many names were pointed out as culprits, all corresponding to the highest figures of the nation at that time. Were these accusations true? Or, as was customary for this government, were they based on lies? Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will try to uncover the whole truth about Stalin's strange death. By the beginning of the 1950s, the health of the Russian dictator was hanging by a thread. His excessive smoking had led to atherosclerosis, and he had even suffered heart attacks shortly after the end of World War II. But due to his extreme paranoia, not even his personal doctors dared to give him a precise diagnosis. He even imprisoned one of them when he suggested that perhaps Stalin should retire from power to improve his well-being. This situation reached its peak in September 1952, when, under Stalin's orders, dozens of doctors were arrested on charges of conspiracy. According to the Soviet leader, they were seeking to eliminate not only him, but also numerous important figures in the Kremlin. Many of these professionals were of Jewish origin, and the doctor's plot, as this event became known, is believed to have been the culmination of his anti-Semitic campaign. The dictator claimed they were working with American agents to overthrow communism. Although there was no evidence, history had already shown that Stalin and his supporters did not need it.
It was Stalin's way of not just settling scores with Jews, but preparing the way for a much wider purge that was in the offing.
Purges had been and were commonplace in Stalin's regime. Millions of Soviets were deported or killed, accused of sabotaging the nation or conspiring to bring about its destruction. This was how Stalin came to power, solidifying his leadership in the 1930s. The persecutions reached their most brutal point in the period from 1936 to 1938. Thanks to this Great Purge, as it was called, the dictator had managed to eliminate almost all of his political rivals, leaving only his figure at the helm of the Soviet Union. Similarly, hundreds of thousands of scientists, professors, writers, and artists were imprisoned or executed. Minorities considered problematic, such as Ukrainians, Kazakhs, Chechens, and many others, were massively deported and their property seized. Even peasants with no political affiliation ended up in Soviet gulags, forced labor camps, or were directly killed. It is estimated that a minimum of 2 million people lost their lives during this period, and nearly the same number were imprisoned on false charges. The organization Stalin used to carry out this campaign of repression was primarily the NKVD, or the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. It not only functioned as the Ministry of Internal Affairs, but also as the Soviet secret police. Its ranks were filled with the most ruthless and loyal agents to the Russian dictator, sometimes surpassing their leaders in terms of cruelty. During the Great Purge, Nikolai Yezhov was in command of the NKVD. His brutality in this role was such that the harshest period of repression is also known as the Yezhovshchina, or Yezhov era.
Desde 1937, Yezhov fusila a una media de 1000 personas al día. Golpead y exterminad a discreción. Más vale pasarse de la raya que quedarse corto.
But the slaughter was getting out of hand for the Soviet leaders. Faced with the fear of a massive uprising among his people, Stalin denounced the actions carried out by the NKVD, which he himself had ordered, and accused Yezhov of being a foreign spy. Now becoming a victim of his own methods, Yezhov was arrested and executed in 1940. One of his lieutenants, named Lavrenti Beria, took his place. It was Beria who was in command of the secret police during the final years of Stalin's rule. On February 28, 1953, the Soviet leadership had gathered at their leader's personal residence. Among the guests were Beria, Nikita Khrushchev, and Georgy Malenkov. These latter two were rapidly gaining power and appeared to be the main candidates to replace Stalin after his death. The purpose of the gathering was not to discuss state affairs, but to enjoy a night of alcohol and movies. At around 4 o'clock in the morning the next day, the guests left the leader alone. Before going to bed, Stalin instructed his guards and servants not to enter his room until they heard that he was awake. Of course, no one dared to contradict his word, but this small detail could have ultimately cost him his life. Hours passed, and the staff still heard no sounds from inside the room. The employees were puzzled but feared the repercussions of disobeying their leader, so they continued not to enter the room. It wasn't until around 11 o'clock at night that the housekeeper gathered the courage to check on the dictator. She found him on the floor, still in his pajamas. He was unconscious and did not respond to her attempts to wake him. Immediately, the guards contacted those who had been present the previous night, but it wasn't until the morning of March 2nd that doctors visited Stalin's room. They found him paralyzed in one arm and leg and unable to speak. Clearly, the diagnosis was not positive. He had suffered a stroke due to high blood pressure, a result of his unhealthy habits. The doctors reported that nothing could be done. Nevertheless, Stalin's agony continued for days. Despite the doctor's efforts to improve his condition, including applying leeches to lower his blood pressure, the leader did not wake up. The only time he briefly regained consciousness, according to witnesses, he glared angrily and fearfully at those gathered around him. Finally, on the night of March 5th, at the age of 74 and after 3 decades in power, Joseph Stalin died.
Сквозь грозы сияло нам солнце свободы, и Ленин великий нам путь озарил. Нас вырастил Сталин на верность народу, на труд и на подвиги нас вдохновил.
The next day, a massive funeral took place that lasted 3 days. Beria, Khrushchev, and Malenkov delivered speeches in front of the thousands of gathered citizens, highlighting Stalin's achievements. They praised how he had led the Soviet Union from the chaos of the Civil War to glory, and how he had defended the territory against the ruthless Nazi invasion. Of course, there was no mention of the purges or persecutions. Due to the enormous crowd, many people were crushed to death. The number of fatalities varies from hundreds to thousands, depending on the sources. Stalin's figure continued to claim victims, even from beyond the grave. The official autopsy conducted by the Kremlin medical team confirmed what the doctors had stated in their reports. The health of the Russian leader, which had been declining sharply, had hit rock bottom, and his body could not withstand it. However, it didn't take long for more sinister theories to start circulating. It was said that natural causes had not been the reason for his death. Stalin's corpse had not yet cooled when internal struggles began over who would seize power in the Soviet Union. The 3 men already mentioned were the most prominent figures, and although they initially tried to divide the government, they realized this would not work. As quickly as they had allied, they began conspiring against each other. Beria fell first. He was arrested, accused of using the NKVD to carry out massive repression campaigns, and without even being put on trial, he was sentenced to death and executed. In this way, he ended up meeting the same fate as his predecessor in the secret police.
When Beria finally realized what was happening and plaintively appealed to his old friend Malenkov to speak for him, Malenkov silently hung his head and pressed a button on his desk. This was an arranged signal to Marshal Georgy Zhukov and a group of armed officers in a nearby room who burst in and arrested Beria.
Malenkov and Khrushchev then began their campaigns to discredit each other. However, Khrushchev's charisma ultimately led him to emerge victorious. In this case, the loser was not executed or imprisoned, but simply dismissed. The new Soviet leader immediately began the process of de-Stalinization. Among his most significant measures, political persecution ceased and amnesty was offered to hundreds of thousands of people. As a result, the gulags lost nearly half of their detainees. Additionally, doctors who had been imprisoned due to Stalin's paranoia were released, and the alleged purge of the Jewish people envisioned by the dictator never materialized. Primarily, Khrushchev exposed the cult of personality that had developed around his predecessor and denounced it whenever possible. He attempted to foster friendlier relations with Western powers, but did not achieve the desired success, likely due to his harshly criticized ideology. Nevertheless, this swift abandonment of Stalin's figure led to speculation that the new leader had been involved in his downfall, perhaps hastening his death. However, those who support this theory argue that Khrushchev did not act alone. According to them, Beria and Malenkov were also involved. It is suspicious that many hours passed from when they were notified of Stalin's relapse until they called his doctors. According to a guard's testimony, upon seeing the dictator, the then chief of the NKVD scolded him for causing unnecessary panic, claiming he was just sleeping. By delaying medical attention for Stalin, they paved the way for Moscow's leader to take his last breath a few days later. While it can be argued that the three acted knowingly, it is equally plausible that they were guided by fear. Stalin had a paranoid temperament that led him to betray those closest to him on impulse, often resulting in imprisonment or death, as previously mentioned. The entire Soviet high command was aware of this fact and constantly reinforced to keep them under control. Perhaps for this reason, none of those present on that fateful day wanted to be the first to disobey the dictator's orders not to disturb him. They may have even feared that calling the doctors would make Stalin consider them incompetent and an attempt to remove him from power. Another reason cited is related to the aforementioned doctors' plot. As mentioned, this supposed conspiracy served as an excuse to accuse Jews and Americans of undermining the Soviet regime. According to some sources, the Russian leader wanted to use these reasons to start a war with his American rivals. To prevent this, his loyal followers were forced to end his life and protect the nation from a conflict that would have cost millions of lives. At least, that's what one of these theories suggests.
Lavrenti Beria, Georgy Malenkov, and Nikita Khrushchev, although not driven by such intimate grievances as Molotov, were deeply aware of Stalin's failing health and the power vacuum his demise would create. Each harbored ambitions of succeeding Stalin and recognized the danger they faced from Stalin's notorious and unpredictable paranoia. Their positions of influence within the Soviet hierarchy were perpetually at risk as long as Stalin was alive, providing a potential motive for wanting to hasten his end.
However, while it cannot be doubted that all three had grievances against Stalin's personality and behavior, there is no concrete evidence that they conspired against him. Nevertheless, it is harder to refute the theory that Lavrenti Beria had something to do with his death. There are many sources of varying reliability claiming that the head of the secret police poisoned the dictator. It is true that Beria coveted Stalin's position and in his final years seemed increasingly unable to conceal his resentment towards him. It is said that during the funeral, while many Soviet leaders openly wept around the coffin, Beria could barely hide his smile. According to Vyacheslav Molotov's biography, former Minister of Foreign Affairs, a few months after Stalin's death, Beria whispered in his ear, "It was me. I saved you from Stalin." Other testimonies claim that Beria selected the doctors and instructed them on what to report. Rumors suggest that some of these doctors were found dead days later. According to these same sources, Beria dismissed all of Stalin's guards and redecorated his room, removing all papers, furniture, and even dishes. Thus, he single-handedly ensured a clear path for the new Soviet leader. If these were indeed his intentions, his plan failed spectacularly, as mentioned earlier. His wife warned him shortly before his imprisonment that his position without Stalin was even more precarious. Of course, all these alleged actions by Beria are not proven. There are no official reports of what really happened during those days when the leader of the Soviet Union agonized until his death. But if there was indeed someone involved in his death, it is very difficult to find a more likely suspect than Lavrenti Beria. There is one final theory we will discuss today, and curiously, it seems to somewhat validate Stalin's paranoia. According to this theory, on the night of February 28th, during the meeting with his comrades, the Soviet leader was poisoned. Once again, the chief of the NKVD appears to be the culprit. Several writers support this accusation. In addition to being the head of the secret police, Beria supervised the Soviet poison laboratory, a covert research and development unit that conducted experiments with chemicals. Whether to seize power or to save Russia from a war with the Americans, he allegedly ordered one of Stalin's guards to poison him. It is even mentioned which substance was used: warfarin, a colorless and odorless anticoagulant that, if taken in excess, could cause the kind of hemorrhages Stalin suffered on his deathbed. It's worth noting that warfarin is also used as a rat poison. But there are some factors that undermine this theory. One of them is that, while the bleeding does seem consistent with warfarin overdose, the rest of the medical picture does not fit with expected symptoms. There is no mention that warfarin could cause strokes, for example. Another more significant reason is Joseph Stalin's extreme paranoia, especially in his later years, which included a profound fear of being poisoned. He took every possible precaution to prevent this, including having food tasters who sampled what he ate and drank before him. It's possible that on the night of February 28th, Beria, or the employee he hired, managed to bypass these barriers, but it doesn't seem likely that the Soviet leader would have let his guard down for even a moment. The official version of Stalin's death still states that it was a cerebral hemorrhage that ended his life. However, as we have seen, there are many other theories that contradict this and offer darker reasons. The reality is that everyone present in those days has since passed away, taking their secrets to the grave. It is very likely that the exact truth will never be known. What remains unquestionable is that many had ample reasons to want the Soviet leader dead. We have reached the end of this video, and we want to ask you, how do you think Stalin died? Don't forget to leave your answer in the comments section and subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left a mystery in history.